A woman stands outside a grocery store in freezing wind, pretending she is checking her phone, but she is actually holding back tears. No one notices her pain, until three small children do. The wind in Cedar Hollow, Colorado cut through coats, like it had something personal against the people standing outside. It was early evening, and the sky had already turned a deep blue-gray. The parking lot lights flickered on, casting pale circles on the icy ground. Serafina Cole stood near the grocery store entrance, her back straight, her phone lifted in her hand as if she were deeply focused on something important. From a distance, she looked like any other woman waiting for a ride or finishing a text. But her screen had been dark for over 5 minutes. Serafina was 32 years old, recently divorced, and still learning how to exist in a world that felt smaller than it used to. Her marriage had ended quietly, without shouting or broken plates. But the silence that followed had been louder than any fight. What hurt most was not just losing her husband. It was the way friends slowly stopped calling. It was the way her own sister told her to stay strong, but never invited her over again. It was the way people picked sides without saying it out loud. She had not lost her job, and she was not homeless. She still paid rent on her small apartment across town. But every room in that apartment echoed. The couch felt too wide. The kitchen table looked like it was waiting for someone who would never come back. Tonight, she had stayed at the grocery store longer than necessary, because going home felt heavier than standing in the cold. Her fingers trembled, but not only from the weather. She blinked quickly, forcing the tears to stay inside. She had promised herself she would not cry in public anymore. Adults were supposed to handle pain quietly. Adults were supposed to move on. That was what everyone had told her. So she pretended to scroll through social media, her thumb moving up and down over a blank screen, while a single tear slipped out and disappeared into the edge of her scarf. People walked past her with carts full of food. No one looked twice. Invisibility had become normal. She had once believed that adulthood meant stability and respect. Instead, it felt like becoming background noise in other people's busy lives. Across the parking lot, Callan Rivers adjusted the hood on his youngest son's jacket, while balancing 2 grocery bags in his other hand. Callan was 35, broad-shouldered, and always tired in a quiet way. He had not planned to raise 3 boys alone. Life had chosen that path for him after his wife passed away 3 years earlier. Since then he had learned how to braid hair for school plays, how to pack 3 identical lunches without mixing them up, and how to keep moving even when grief sat heavy on his chest. His triplets, Bodie, Everett, and Milo, were 6 years old and full of restless energy. They walked in a tight group, their small boots crunching against the icy ground. Callan's focus was on making sure none of them slipped. He did not notice the woman near the entrance. But Bodie did. Bodie slowed his steps first. Everett followed. Milo tilted his head slightly, studying Serafina with open curiosity. Children often saw things adults trained themselves to ignore. They did not understand social rules about privacy, or pretending everything was fine. They understood faces. They understood shaking hands and eyes that looked like they were trying too hard. Milo tugged lightly at Callan's coat, but Callan was digging his keys out of his pocket, and did not see the direction his sons were staring. The boys stopped walking altogether now, their attention locked on the woman who looked like she was reading something, very serious on her phone. Serafina felt it before she saw them. That strange sense of being watched. She lowered her phone slightly and noticed 3 small boys standing a few feet away. Their cheeks were pink from the cold. Their eyes were not judging. They were not curious in a cruel way. They were simply present. For a brief second she felt embarrassed. Maybe her tears had been obvious. Maybe she looked weak. She straightened her shoulders quickly, wiping under her eyes as if brushing away snow. She expected the boys to laugh or whisper. Children could be honest in ways that hurt. Instead, they just looked concerned. Everett whispered something to Bodie. Milo took a small step forward. The wind pushed against Serafina's coat again, making her shiver. She realized how alone she must appear from the outside. A grown woman standing still in freezing weather with nowhere to go. Callan finally looked up and noticed his sons had stopped. He followed their line of sight and saw Serafina. For a moment he assumed they were just distracted. He was about to call them back when Milo gently pulled away from his brothers. The smallest of the 3 did not hesitate. While Callan stood frozen in surprise, Milo walked straight toward Serafina with slow, careful steps, as if approaching a frightened animal he did not want to scare away. Bodhi and Everett exchanged a look before following behind him. Serafina's breath caught in her throat. She did not know what to prepare for. Advice, questions, pity. She braced herself for the kind of attention she had learned to fear since her divorce, the kind that made her feel like a problem that needed solving. Serafina expects judgment, but the smallest boy reaches for a shaking hand. Callan Rivers never planned to raise 3 boys alone, but he never ran when life broke apart. Callan Rivers used to believe that life moved in a straight line. He thought hard work led to security, love led to forever, and family meant stability. But 3 years ago, that straight line bent in a way he never saw coming. His wife, Alara, became sick in a way doctors could not fix. The illness moved slowly at first, giving them false hope. Then it moved fast. By the time Bodhi, Everett, and Milo turned 3, they were already learning words like hospital and medicine instead of playground and vacation. When Alara passed away, the town of Cedar Hollow showed up in full force. Neighbors brought casseroles. Church members filled the living room with soft voices and gentle hugs. Callan remembered standing there numb, holding 3 small boys who did not understand why their mother was not coming home. For a while, he was surrounded by support. But grief is heavy, and over time, people slowly returned to their own lives. The visits became fewer. The phone calls stopped. The meals ended. Callan did not blame them. Everyone had their own families to take care of. Still, the house felt emptier once the quiet returned. He never thought about leaving. That option did not exist in his mind. He was a father. His sons needed someone who stayed, so he stayed. He took a delivery driving job during the day and worked nights at a warehouse outside town. Sleep became something he fit into small spaces between responsibilities. Some mornings he felt like his body was moving before his mind had fully woken up. But he packed lunches, tied shoes, and showed up at school events with tired eyes and steady hands. Exhaustion became normal, but so did resilience. Callan did not teach his boys to hide their feelings. He did not tell them to be tough or to stop crying. Instead, he told them that feelings were real, and that caring about others was strength, not weakness. When Bodhi asked about their mother, Callan answered honestly in simple words. When Everett felt scared at night, Callan sat beside his bed until he fell asleep. When Milo cried over small things, Callan never laughed. He listened. Some people in town quietly admired him. Others simply saw a tired single dad doing his best. But no one saw the nights when he sat alone at the kitchen table after the boys were asleep, staring at an old photo of Alara, and wondering if he was enough for his children. He carried his loneliness differently than Serafina did. She let her tears fall in cold parking lots. He swallowed his pain and kept moving. Men were often taught that staying strong meant staying silent. That evening at the grocery store, Callan's mind had been focused on small tasks. Make sure the boys had gloves. Do not drop the eggs. Get home before the temperature dropped more. He had not noticed Serafina at first, but his sons had. When Milo stepped away from him, Callan felt a quick wave of embarrassment. He worried that maybe the boys were bothering a stranger. He walked closer, ready to apologize if needed. Yet as he approached, he saw something in Serafina's face that stopped him. It was not annoyance. It was not anger. It was pain trying to stay hidden. The boys stood in front of her, like a small wall of protection. Bodhi looked up at her with serious eyes. Everett shifted his weight nervously but did not step back. Milo, the smallest, gently held out the extra scarf he had been carrying. It was blue, slightly too big for him, and still warm from his neck. Serafina tried to shake her head politely. She lifted her hand as if to refuse, but her fingers trembled too much. Words formed in her throat but would not come out clearly. The cold and the emotion mixed together, making her voice weak. She had grown used to declining help, to saying she was fine even when she was not. But in front of 3 children who were simply offering warmth, her usual defenses felt unnecessary. Callan felt awkward standing there. Part of him wanted to pull the boys back and avoid making the woman uncomfortable. Another part of him understood exactly why they had walked over. He had raised them to notice people. He had taught them that if someone looked sad, you did not ignore it. You showed up. So he let them. Everett gently adjusted the scarf around Serafina's shoulders without asking for anything in return. Bodhi held out a small paper cup of hot chocolate they had just bought from inside. Milo stayed closest to her, still holding her hand as if afraid she might disappear. In that small moment, something shifted. The parking lot did not feel as cold. The space between strangers felt smaller. Callan realized that his sons were doing something he himself had struggled to do since his wife passed away. They were reaching outward instead of folding inward. Children had a way of softening adults who had grown hard from loss. Serafina finally managed a quiet thank you, her voice barely steady. She looked overwhelmed, but not in a bad way. It was the look of someone who had forgotten what simple kindness felt like. Callan saw the same loneliness in her eyes that he saw in his own reflection some nights. It was the loneliness of staying when others leave, of carrying responsibility quietly, of pretending strength all the time. He stepped closer now, no longer embarrassed. He met her gaze fully for the first time. In that brief exchange there were no long speeches, no dramatic gestures, just recognition. Callan finally looks directly into Serafina's eyes and recognizes the same loneliness he carries. The boys don't see a stranger. They see someone who needs choosing. Bodhi was always the serious one. He watched people closely, like he was trying to understand what they were not saying. Everett was softer, more thoughtful, often noticing small details like when someone looked tired or cold. Milo, the smallest by just a few minutes, carried the biggest heart. He moved first, spoke first, and felt everything deeply. Losing their mother so young had changed them in quiet ways, while other 6-year-olds worried about toys and cartoons. These boys understood sadness. They had seen it in their father's eyes. They had felt it in their own chests. It made them gentle in a way most children were not. Standing in the cold parking lot, they did not see Serafina as a stranger. They saw the same tightness around her eyes that they had once seen in Callan's face after long nights. They saw hands that shook the way theirs had during the first winter without their mother. Children who had known loss learned to recognize it. Serafina felt overwhelmed as Milo's small fingers wrapped around hers. His hand was warm despite the freezing air. Bodhi looked up at her and asked in a simple voice if she was waiting for someone. The question was not sharp or nosy. It was hope. Nest. Everett tilted his head and asked if she liked hot chocolate because they had extra. Their words were easy and clear, the kind that carried no hidden meaning. Serafina tried to answer normally. She told them she was fine and that they should go back to their father. But her voice sounded distant even to herself. The boys did not move. They stood there like they had made a decision together without speaking about it. Milo gently tugged her closer to where Callan was standing, as if including her was the most natural thing in the world. Callan stepped forward, offering a small, understanding nod. He suggested they all go inside the small cafe attached to the grocery store so the boys would not freeze. It was not a dramatic invitation. It was practical, but the way the boys looked at Serafina made it clear they expected her to come too. She hesitated. Adults had rules about strangers and boundaries. Adults worried about how things looked. For a second she imagined people watching and making assumptions, but the wind picked up again, and Milo's hand did not let go. Something inside her, tired of always standing alone, gave in. She nodded quietly and followed them inside. The cafe was warm and smelled like coffee and baked bread. The windows were fogged from the heat. Callan found a table near the corner where the boys could sit together. Without asking permission, Everett pulled out an extra chair. Bodhi placed the hot chocolate in front of Serafina like it belonged there. Milo climbed into his seat, but kept one hand resting lightly on her coat sleeve, as if afraid she might disappear. People glanced over. A few shoppers seemed confused by the sight of a single Fath. With 3 identical boys, and a quiet woman who did not look related to them. Some eyes carried curiosity, others carried judgment. In small towns, stories were often created before facts were known. Serafina felt that familiar pressure of being misunderstood. But this time, something felt different. She was not standing alone in the cold. She was sitting at a table with 4 people who acted like she belonged there. The boys began asking her simple questions. They wanted to know her favorite color. They asked if she liked snow. Everett told her that their dad made the best pancakes on Saturdays. Bodhi explained that Milo always cried during sad movies. Their openness slowly chipped away at the wall around her heart. She answered in short sentences at first. Then her words grew longer. She told them she used to like ice skating when she was younger. She admitted she preferred summer but thought snow looked pretty at night. Callan watched carefully but did not interrupt. He saw the way her shoulders relaxed inch by inch. He recognized the same guarded look he used to carry when neighbors asked if he was managing okay after Alara passed. Pain had a way of making adults distant, but children, with their direct honesty, could break through that distance without even trying. As the minutes passed, warmth filled more than just the cafe. Serafina found herself smiling at something Milo said about building a snow fort taller than their house. The sound of her own laughter surprised her. It had been weeks since she had laughed without forcing it. The boys reacted instantly to that laugh, their faces lighting up as if they had accomplished something important in that small company. Our table. Unexpected kindness replaced status. It did not matter that Serafina was recently divorced or that Callan worked 2 jobs. It did not matter who had more or less. What mattered was presence. What mattered was staying. Serafina realized she was not thinking about her empty apartment for the first time that day. She was not replaying the words of people who had quietly stepped away from her life. Instead, she was listening to 3 children explain the difference between identical and fraternal twins with complete confidence, even though they were not fully sure themselves. Time passed faster than she expected. Eventually, she glanced toward the window and noticed the sky had grown darker. Responsibility tugged at her again. She could not simply step into someone else's world. She slowly pushed her chair back, thanking Callan softly and telling the boys she should head home. The warmth in the cafe suddenly felt fragile. Milo's smile faded. Bodhi looked down at the table. Everett reached for her hand without thinking. As she prepares to leave, one of the boys refuses to let go of her hand. One extra chair at a small cafe table changes 5 lonely lives. The chair had been empty when Callan first chose the table. It was meant for 4 people, just enough space for him and his 3 boys. Yet somehow, when Serafina slowly sat back down instead of leaving, that empty chair no longer looked extra. It looked necessary. The cafe lights reflected softly against the window, and outside, the evening had turned darker. Inside, something quieter and more important was beginning to grow. Serafina did not sit on the edge of the chair this time. She allowed herself to set Tila fully into it, placing both hands around the warm cup in front of her. The heat soaked into her cold fingers, but it was more than just temperature that made her feel steady. It was the way the boys relaxed when she stayed. It was the way Milo leaned slightly against her arm, like her presence was expected now. Callan noticed the shift immediately. He'd spent years learning how to read emotional changes in small details. He saw how her shoulders dropped a little, how her breathing slowed. He felt a quiet responsibility to keep the moments safe. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady. That was how he had survived the past 3 years, by taking life in small, careful steps, without turning the table into something heavy. Callan shared small pieces of his life. He mentioned how mornings were the hardest, because getting 3 6-year-olds ready for school felt like managing a small storm. He explained how he worked delivery routes during the day and warehouse shifts at night, not to gain praise, but simply because that was what needed to be done. His tone was calm, not proud and not bitter. He had accepted his role fully. Staying had never been a question for him. Serafina listened closely. She had seen single parents before, but hearing it described in such simple honesty felt different. She admired how he spoke about responsibility without sounding like a victim of it. She shared only a small part of her own story in return. She explained that her marriage had ended quietly, and that sometimes quiet endings hurt more because there was no one clear moment to blame. She did not go into details about friends who had slowly drifted away, or family members who had chose and distance. But the weight of rejection was clear in the way she chose her words carefully. There was no long emotional speech between them. The tension at the table was gentle, like 2 people stepping onto thin ice but hoping it would hold. The boys filled the silence naturally. Bodhi kept an eye on Serafina whenever someone walked past their table, almost protective without realizing it. Everett offered her the last cookie from their plate without hesitation. Milo kept making small comments about how cold it had been outside, as if reminding her she did not have to stand there alone. Again, Serafina noticed the way Callan handled each of his sons. He did not raise his voice. He did not rush them. Even when Everett accidentally knocked over a napkin holder, Callan simply steadied it and gave a patient look that carried both discipline and kindness. It was quiet strength, the kind that did not demand attention but earned respect. For a woman who had felt unwanted for months, seeing a man who stayed steady under pressure felt powerful. The theme of staying hung between them without being spoken directly. Callan had stayed for his children when others had returned to their own lives. Serafina had tried to stay strong even when people stepped away from her. Both of them understood what it meant to carry loneliness quietly. Both of them feared the risk of opening up again. Callan felt that fear clearly now. Inviting someone new into his world was not simple. His boys had already lost one important person. He did not want to introduce uncertainty. At the same time, watching them respond so naturally to Serafina made him question his own guarded heart. Children were often braver than adults. They did not measure risk the same way. They measured warmth. Serafina carried her own fear. Sitting at that table felt good, but good things had left her before. She worried about becoming temporary in someone else's life. She worried about being tolerated instead of truly wanted. Even as she smiled at the boys' small stories, part of her mind whispered that this could disappear as quickly as it appeared. Then Bodhi said something simple that shifted the air again. He mentioned that they came to this cafe most Fridays after grocery shopping. Everett nodded and added that sometimes they played board games at home on Saturdays. Milo looked at Serafina with open expectation, as if future plans were already forming in his head. It was not a formal invitation. It was not even fully thought out. It was innocent and natural, the way children assume that someone who feels safe today will still be safe tomorrow. Callan felt his heartbeat quicken slightly. He knew what that look in his son's eyes meant. They were not just enjoying a moment. They were hoping for more. He glanced at Serafina carefully, searching for discomfort. But instead he saw something softer, a mixture of surprise and quiet longing. The shift from strangers to connection did not happen loudly. It happened in the way no one rushed to end the evening. It happened in the way Serafina no longer checked her dark phone screen. It happened in the way Callan stopped standing slightly apart and allowed himself to sit fully at the table instead of half-turned toward the exit. Eventually, reality pressed in gently. The boys needed to get home before it grew too late. Serafina knew she could not avoid her apartment forever. Chairs scraped softly against the cafe floor as they stood. Callan picked up the empty cups, and the boys gathered around Serafina as if forming a small circle of warmth. Callan cleared his throat and offered to walk her to her car, his voice steady but cautious. It was a simple gesture, one rooted more in care than romance. Serafina nodded, feeling both nervous and grateful. As they stepped toward the cafe door, the first thick snowflakes began to fall outside, heavier than before, covering the parking lot in sudden white. Callan offers to walk her to her car, but snow begins falling heavily. A snowstorm forces them together longer than planned. The snow did not fall gently that night. It came down fast and thick, covering the parking lot in minutes and turning the world outside the cafe into a blur of white. What was supposed to be a short walk to Serafina's car became something slower, heavier, and uncertain. The storm was not violent, but it was steady, the kind that changed plans without asking permission. In that quiet Colorado town, people were used to snow. Still, no one had expected it to begin so suddenly. Callan walked slightly ahead, shielding the boys from the wind while Serafina followed close beside them. The cold no longer felt as sharp as it had earlier. Maybe it was because she was no longer standing alone. Milo reached back and held her hand again without hesitation, as if it had already become routine. Bodhi and Everett walked on either side of her, careful and alert, like small protectors who had decided she was part of their circle. When they reached her car, Serafina pressed the unlock button and gave a small, hopeful breath. She opened the door, sat inside, and turned the key. The engine made a weak clicking sound but did not start. She tried again. The same hollow sound answered back. Her stomach tightened. The cold had drained the battery. For a second, embarrassment washed over her. She hated being a problem. She hated needing help. It reminded her too much of the months after her divorce, when she had asked for emotional support and received polite distance instead. She stepped out of the car slowly, brushing snow from her coat. Callan understood the situation immediately. He did not sigh or look frustrated. He simply nodded and said they would figure it out. He moved with calm purpose. Checking under the hood, even though he already guessed the issue. The boys stood close to Serafina, their small shoulders pressing against her sides to share warmth. They did not see her as someone inconvenient. They acted as if this delay was just another part of the evening they were meant to share. The practical problem created a strange closeness. There was no rush now, no quick goodbye. The storm made leaving impossible for the moment. Callan suggested they wait inside his truck, while he called a friend who might have jumper cables nearby. His tone was steady, not dramatic. He was used to solving problems quietly. That was part of being a single parent. There was no one else to panic for him. Inside the truck, the heater hummed softly. The boys talked about how cool it would be if school got canceled the next day. Milo leaned against Serafina again, completely comfortable. Everett handed her one of his gloves because he thought her hands still looked cold. Bodhi kept watching her face, making sure she did not seem upset. Serafina felt something inside her begin to loosen. She had spent months feeling like an outsider in her own life. Yet here, in a snow-covered parking lot, 3 children were treating her like she already belonged. They did not ask if she deserved it. They did not question her past. They simply made space for her. As they waited, the quiet between her and Callan grew softer. She found herself speaking more honestly than she planned. She admitted that going home felt lonely most nights. She shared that sometimes she left the television on just to fill the silence. Her voice did not shake this time. It was steady, but tired. Callan listened carefully. He did not interrupt. After a pause, he shared something he rarely said out loud. He told her that some nights he sat awake long after the boys were asleep, worrying he was not enough for them. He feared missing something important in their lives because he was too busy working. He feared failing them in ways he would never fully see. His voice carried strength, but also truth. That honesty built a bridge between them. Vulnerability did not weaken either of them. It made them real. Serafina realized that strength was not about pretending everything was fine. It was about staying even when things were hard. Callan had stayed for his sons. She had stayed through her own rejection. In different ways, they both understood endurance. Outside, a few people from the cafe glanced toward the truck, noticing the group huddled together. The small-town habit of watching others was still present, but something about the scene looked less unusual now. It looked less like strangers, and more like a family waiting out bad weather together. Serafina felt warmth she had not felt in years. It was not romantic or dramatic. It was steady and grounded. It was the warmth of being included without having to prove anything. The storm outside continued, but inside the truck, the air felt safe. Eventually, Callan's friend texted that he was on his way with cables. Relief spread through the truck, but with it came a quiet realization that the night would soon return to normal. The temporary closeness created by snow would end. As Serafina reached into her coat pocket to check the time, her phone vibrated. The screen lit up with a message from her ex-husband. For a second she considered ignoring it, but her eyes moved before her mind could stop them. The words were short and cold, reminding her once again that she had never been enough. Her chest tightened, and the warmth inside the truck suddenly felt fragile. Serafina receives a painful text from her ex reminding her she was never enough. Just when she begins to feel seen, her past tries to pull her back into shame. The warmth inside the truck faded the moment Serafina read the message. The words were not long, but they carried years of quiet damage. Her ex-husband had a way of making everything sound calm and reasonable while still placing blame on her shoulders. The message reminded her that she had always been too emotional, too distant, too much, and somehow never enough at the same time. Even after the divorce, his voice still found ways to reach her. Her chest tightened as if the cold air from outside had slipped through the windows. The safe feeling she had just started to accept began to crack. For a brief second, she forgot about the snow, the boys, and the steady presence beside her. She was back in her old kitchen months ago, listening to careful words that slowly made her doubt herself. She did not realize her expression had changed until Milo shifted beside her. The boys had been laughing about building a snow tunnel between their house and the garage. Now their laughter softened. Bodhi leaned forward slightly, studying her face the way he always did when something felt wrong. Everett stopped talking mid-sentence. Children who had experienced loss knew how to sense emotional shifts without being told. Serafina quickly locked her phone and forced a small smile. She did not want to bring her past into this warm space. She did not want to look fragile again. But the smile did not fully reach her eyes. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, even though the heater was still running. Callan noticed too. He had learned to read silence the same way his sons had. It was in what she said that caught his attention. It was what she stopped saying. Her posture stiffened. Her gaze moved toward the window, like she was already planning her exit. The emotional spiral began quietly inside her. Old doubts returned with familiar speed. Maybe this moment was temporary. Maybe she was stepping into something that would not last. Maybe she did not belong here after all. Shame had a way of speaking louder than kindness. Before she could withdraw completely, Milo climbed across the seat and placed himself directly beside her. Everett began telling an exaggerated story about how their dad once burned pancakes so badly that the smoke alarm went off. Bodhi added dramatic details that made it sound like a full disaster. The boys were not trying to ignore her sadness. They were gently surrounding. They had seen this before. After their mother passed, there were days when Callan would grow quiet in the middle of normal life. Instead of asking heavy questions, they would sit closer to him or bring him something small. They had learned that presence sometimes helped more than solutions. Serafina watched as Callan responded to the boys' teasing with calm patience. He did not act embarrassed. He let them speak. He corrected details lightly but allowed their laughter to fill the truck. His parenting was steady and gentle. He did not control the moment. He supported it. As she observed him, something shifted inside her again. This was what staying looked like. It was not dramatic promises. It was not big speeches about forever. It was showing up in small moments, even when feelings were complicated. Callan was not trying to fix her mood. He was simply remaining present. The storm outside continued, snow piling higher against the tires. It would have been easy for her to say she needed to go, to call a ride, to step away before the fragile connection deepened. Part of her wanted to retreat to her apartment, where no one expected anything from her. She even reached for the door handle once, thinking she might wait outside for Callan's friend to arrive with the cables. But before she could move fully, Everett placed his small hand over hers without speaking. It was not forceful. It was a simple reminder that she was not invisible here. Callan spoke gently, not asking about the message, not demanding explanation. He just mentioned that storms usually passed faster than people expected in Cedar Hollow. His tone carried meaning beyond weather. He was telling her, in his own way, that hard moments did not always last. Serafina felt tears press against her eyes again. But this time they were different. They were not only about rejection, they were about the fear of believing in something better. Hope required courage. Trust required risk. She realized she had spent months measuring her worth based on someone who had already chosen to leave. Sitting in that truck, surrounded by 3 boys who had chosen to stay close, and a father who remained steady under pressure, she began to question that old narrative. Maybe she had never been the problem. Maybe she had simply been in the wrong place. The headlights of another vehicle appeared through the snow as Callan's friend arrived with jumper cables. The practical solution was here. The night would soon move forward again. Serafina wiped her eyes carefully, trying to gather herself before ping back into the cold. Before she could fully compose herself, Milo turned toward her. His small arms wrapped tightly around her middle in a sudden, firm hug. He pressed his cheek against her coat as if sealing something important. In a soft, certain voice, he told her she felt safe. Milo hugs her tightly and calls her safe. For the first time since her divorce, someone chooses her without conditions. The hug stayed with Serafina long after Milo let go. It was not dramatic or loud, but it carried something she had not felt in a long time. It carried certainty. A child who had known loss had called her safe. That word settled deep inside her chest and gently pushed against the old belief that she was never enough. For months after her divorce, she had felt like someone who had been quietly unselected. Friends had stepped back. Family had grown distant. Even simple invitations had stopped coming. But that night, in the middle of a snowstorm, she felt chosen. After the jumper cables did their job and her car engine finally turned on, Callan did not rush the goodbye. He stood near her window while the boys waved from the truck. The snow had slowed to a soft fall now, and the world looked clean and new under the streetlights. Callan mentioned that the boys usually had pancakes on Saturday mornings, and sometimes built blanket forts afterward. His tone was careful, not demanding. It was an opening, not pressure. Serafina felt fear rise for a second. Accepting meant risking. Accepting meant stepping into something she could lose. But the thought of returning to her silent apartment felt heavier than the risk. She nodded and said she would like to visit. The decision felt small on the outside but huge inside her heart. It was the first time she had stepped towards something instead of away from it in months. The next afternoon she found herself standing on Callan's porch, holding a small box of bakery muffins. Her hands were steady this time. When the door opened, the boys greeted her with excitement. Tea that did not look forced. They acted as if she had always been part of their routine. That simple acceptance softened something inside her. Callan's house was modest but warm. Toys were neatly stacked in corners. School drawings were taped to the fridge. The air smelled like coffee and syrup. It did not feel perfect. It felt lived in. Serafina noticed how everything reflected effort rather than ease. Raising 3 boys alone was not simple, but Callan had built a steady home for them. During the afternoon, the boys insisted on showing her their favorite things. Everett displayed a small collection of smooth stones he kept on his windowsill. Bodhi showed her a book he was reading about space. Milo proudly demonstrated how high he could stack blocks without them falling. Each moment was shared with open trust. Then, without warning, Bodhi walked over to a shelf in the living room and picked up a framed photograph. He handed it to Serafina carefully. It was a picture of their mother, smiling brightly, holding the boys when they were toddlers. The room grew quieter for a moment. Serafina looked at the photo with respect. She did not look away awkwardly. She did not try to replace the memory. She simply acknowledged it with warmth. She told the boys their mother looked kind and strong. Callan watched closely, his expression unreadable but thoughtful. This moment mattered more than anything else. Serafina understood she was not stepping into a space to erase someone. She was stepping into a space that already held love. She would never replace Alara, and she did not want to. She only wanted to be someone who stayed. Callan felt both gratitude and fear. He had guarded his heart carefully for years. Moving too fast could hurt everyone involved. He worried about giving his boys hope that might disappear. At the same time, watching Serafina treat their mother's memory with such quiet respect eased some of that fear. She was not trying to take over. She was simply adding herself gently. Serafina carried her own fear. What if this warmth faded? What if she became temporary in their lives? She had known what it felt like to be slowly edged out before. She did not want to become a short chapter in the boy's story. Still, as the afternoon passed, she noticed how naturally she fit into the rhythm of the house. She helped Everett clean up spilled juice without being asked. She listened to Bodhi explain his space facts without pretending interest. She let Milo sit beside her while he colored. Found family did not form in loud declarations. It grew slowly in small acts. It grew in shared snacks and easy laughter. It grew in the space between caution and courage. As evening approached, Callan mentioned dinner casually, saying they usually kept it simple on Saturdays. He did not formally invite her to stay. He simply moved toward the kitchen as if leaving the decision open. Serafina felt the familiar pull of hesitation. Staying for dinner felt bigger than visiting for an hour. It felt like stepping deeper into their world. She thought about her empty apartment again. She thought about the word safe. Then she placed the bakery box on the counter and began helping set plates on the table without making a speech about it. The boys cheered softly as if she had passed a secret test. Callan noticed and allowed himself a small smile. Dinner was simple but full. Conversation moved easily. No one forced anything. It felt natural, like something that had been building since that cold night outside the grocery store. As they finished eating, Milo looked up at her with open hope in his eyes. One of the boys asks if she will come back tomorrow. Winter does not end that night, but loneliness does. The snow did not disappear the next day. It stayed on rooftops and sidewalks for weeks, covering Cedar Hollow in white silence. But something inside Serafina changed after that stormy night. The cold still existed outside, yet it no longer lived inside her chest the same way. What began as one unexpected evening slowly turned into a steady pattern of presence. Weeks passed in small, meaningful moments. Serafina started visiting Callan's house every Saturday at first, then sometimes on weeknights after work. She did not rush her way into their lives. She moved gently, respecting space, understanding that trust was something built slowly. The boys began to expect her in ways that felt natural, not forced. Everett would save her a seat during board games. Bodhi would ask her opinion about school projects. Milo simply leaned against her whenever she sat down, as if that had always been his place. The community began to notice the change. At the grocery store, people who once walked past Serafina without seeing her now saw her standing beside Callan and the boys. There were still curious looks, but they felt softer. She was no longer a woman alone in the cold parking lot. She was part of something steady. Some neighbors even smiled at her in a way they had not before, not because her worth had changed, but because her posture had. She no longer carried herself like someone waiting to be rejected. Callan changed too, though in quieter ways. He had spent years focusing only on survival. Work, parenting, sleep, repeat. Now he allowed small pieces of joy back into his routine. He invited Serafina to stay for dinner more often. He listened when she shared thoughts about her da. Why? He found himself looking forward to her presence in a way that both comforted and scared him. Opening his heart again meant remembering what it felt like to lose. But staying closed would mean missing something real. Serafina slowly gained confidence that had nothing to do with appearance or status. It came from being needed in simple ways. When Milo struggled with reading, she sat beside him patiently until he finished a full page. When Everett worried about a spelling test, she helped him practice without making him feel small. When Bodhi asked hard questions about his mother's memory, she answered gently, but always directed the deepest parts back to Callan, honoring his place. She stopped pretending not to cry. One evening, while washing dishes at Callan's sink, she felt tears slip down her face as she remembered how different her life had looked a year ago. This time, she did not hide them. She did not step outside into the cold. Callan noticed and simply stood beside her, not trying to fix the feeling, just sharing the space. The boys saw too, and instead of panic, they offered a group hug that ended in soft laughter. Crying no longer meant weakness. It meant healing. Emotional healing showed itself in daily acts. It was in the way Serafina began decorating her own apartment again instead of leaving walls bare. It was in the way Callan allowed himself to talk about future plans without lowering his voice. It was in the way the boys started referring to outings as something we were doing instead of separating who belonged. The shift from rejected to chosen did not happen in one grand moment. It happened every time someone stayed. Every time Callan texted to Che, CK if she made it home safe. Every time Serafina showed up to a school event without being asked twice. Every time the boys reached for her hand without doubt. Family began to look different in Cedar Hollow. It was no longer defined only by biology or old expectations. It was defined by presence. The boys redefined it most clearly. To them, family was whoever stayed for pancake mornings and spelling practice. It was whoever listened to bedtime fears. It was whoever showed up when the snow fell too hard. Callan made a quiet decision one evening while watching Serafina laugh with the boys in the living room. He chose to stay emotionally, not just physically. Staying meant letting himself care fully. It meant accepting that love after loss was not betrayal, it was growth. He did not make a dramatic speech. He simply reached for her hand and held it with certainty. Serafina made her own quiet choice. She chose to trust what was in front of her instead of fearing what might disappear. She stopped measuring her value by the words of someone who had left. She allowed herself to believe that being chosen did not require perfection. There was no sudden proposal, no grand public declaration. Stability became their foundation. Safety became their language. The boys continued to grow, carrying both their mother's memory and Serafina's presence without confusion. Love did not replace. It expanded. One evening, as winter finally began to soften and patches of grass appeared through melting snow, Serafina stood outside Callan's house watching the boys chase each other in the yard. The air was still cold, but not bitter. Callan stood beside her, quiet and steady. She thought back to that night outside the grocery store when she had pretended to scroll through a dark phone screen, trying not to cry. At the time it had felt like the lowest point of her life. Now she understood something different. That cold night had not been the end of her story. It had been the beginning of being chosen. If this story touched something inside you, Don't just scroll away from it. Stories like this grow when people who believe in kindness choose to pass them forward. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that being chosen can change everything, and stay connected for more stories that heal quietly but deeply. And before you leave, here's something to think about. Have you ever met someone on an ordinary day who ended up changing your whole life without even trying? Tell us your moment in the comments,